So this introduction just describes the early 10,000 year ago primitive Neolithic ceramic era, and then the Shang Dynasties about 3,200 years ago, primitive porcelain, and also I think the period for brass. And then the Tang Dynasty, 618-907, sold apparently throughout the world, although I thought that was a later period. So this first portion is the Neolithic, 8,000 to 2000 BC. These look pretty sophisticated for 4,000 years ago to this uneducated brain. And yet the designs look rather primitive, almost Australian Aboriginal. Almost looks anthropomorphic, doesn't it? A cute one. Looks like it were made out of brass, but it's probably not. This takes us from 1600 to 220, which is right around the period of Qin Shi Huangdi Emperor, who created the terracotta army, or obviously had it created for him. Certainly what we're looking at here compared to what we've seen is just the rudiment of design. Function was probably all important. The resources, time and labor were probably extensive to do anything in those days. Here, very creative, or at least the roots of its beginning. How curious the top part is. So what would have been the function for this bowl? This next period spans the about 360 years, as it says, of the Eastern Han, the three kingdoms, when the China broke up into three kingdoms, and then the Western Eastern Jin, Southern and Northern Dynasties. Again, another animal, a sheep. And then for condiments, perhaps? Who knows? But certainly that idea is not novel. I've always wondered what these little, look like rope handles are. Designed perhaps for it to hang and then to be poured while hanging. A small one like this to be hung around the neck like a flask. This with apparently molded flower designs, perhaps applied after the main pot was thrown. An interesting design, probably very creative technique to get that fluting, particularly to run up that very decreasing sized spout. And what would it have been used for? Interesting how simplicity can sometimes be the most difficult to achieve. This is a mother lion with the cub between her legs. This is labeled variegated Tang tricolor pottery. How astounding a piece that is. This is the heavenly king of the Tang Dynasty. An allusion to its Silk Road history, perhaps. Of a warrior from the Tang Dynasty. Imagine how much can be learned today from the costume depicted. Amazing that such figurines have been protected all this time. How diminutive the man looks. I think out of proportion. This is the phoenix-headed style of this Tang vessel. And here a waist drum. And I wonder, I think I detect that one end is a smaller dynamometer than the other, producing a different sound. Whimsical. It all begins to look so redundant after a while to the uneducated mind that I just look for those pieces that intrigue. I note this simply because we saw something that looked like this painted design, but not geometric. And this comes from Banpo in the Yangshao culture, which is down near Guilin. And Bangpo is a very ancient city, which I probably won't go to unless a tour takes me to it. These, I believe, are headrests. It's interesting that both the Chinese and the Egyptian used headrests, but not at all. In fact, quite the opposite in the European culture. Here you necessarily, I believe, lay on your back, whereas oftentimes Europeans, Americans lay in the fetal position. Same here, but a little bit more elongated. But you notice that even the design is subtly designed to keep your head centered. And here a tiger headrest. Would this whimsical piece have been for a young emperor, prince? Some examples of this blue and white pottery that we've learned to recognize, at least in a very simplistic way, and here red. The pottery that I'm looking at now was from the 1368-1644 Ming Dynasty period, from Jin S. And at that time they employed apparently 10,000 workers. No surprise at the volume, no surprise at the intricacy, no surprise at the quality. When out of that should come how few great artisans. This pottery, I believe, is what began to spread around the world. I wonder how much of the evolution of design was the response to the likes of the emperor and his court. You can imagine this piled with fruit at some sumptuous banquet, never guessing that it would reside in a museum to be looked at by thousands, if not more. These are polychrome, whatever that means. Certainly multiple colors. Here a fish motif from the 1644 periods. Notice the range that we've seen between the simple and the very ornate. And that's not just from the primitive period, but between relatively recent periods. All a question of style and preference. I'll just describe what is said about this as we look at it. Covered jar with red sea wave above the yellow design of dragon and clouds. Beijing reign, 1522-1566. Ming Dynasty, 1368-1644. This is called a fawa stool. It looks like it would have been a drum, or at least an allusion to a drum. Fawa is also the name of a temple in Beijing, I believe. Now this you must look at closely to see how the vignette has been carved out, so you can see into it. Perhaps in there might have been incense flames. beautiful vase. Look at the elephant motif. And apparently inside there's something that revolves. Here again, the remarkable elegance of simplicity. I use the word elegance over and over again because in my mind it's the only word it thinks of that reflects this. Modernistic to my mind. Very well then, you choose the word. This is the shape of the canopic jars of the Egyptian mummies. I'll give you a view of the overall piece, but then I want to focus on the detail of each section. This is like looking at the stupas, or more importantly, the huge temples of Thailand. From the top down, each has a little element that can be looked at closely. Here, with a certain amount of irony, this vase reflects a ceramic workshop elements. Now there's various rooms of different functions. We'll look closely at just a part of it. I can't decipher it closely enough in the camera, but I will when I get it on the computer.